Happy Friday, socialites, and welcome to the best damn social club in the universe. I'm your host, Jedi ASU, and thank you so much for spending a portion of your Friday night with me and my guests. And excited to have this conversation. It's very relevant, very pertinent. I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback and interactions in the chat as well. As always, make sure you sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and we are off. And let's get social. It is 19th of March, 2021. Hopefully your week was outstanding. Hopefully your feet hurt because you've kicked so much ass this week. Looking forward to having a conversation with my man, Namle. He is a brilliant writer. Excellent follow on the Twitterverse if you has not, and I am lucky enough to call him friend. Nam, you are on the social club. How are you, sir?
Cheers, Jedi. Thank you so much for having me. And as usual, I like to tell people to believe roughly half of how I'm sold. So, I'm like an okay writer and decent friend of Jedi ASU, and I'm just really happy to be here because this kind of just came about very quickly in terms of an appearance.
Absolutely. It was a brilliant. And also, I always hype you at 200%, so you are 100% complete. So how's that? So I'm grateful for you for reaching out because I know this is a very relevant and important topic, and it's something that we had kind of had a back and forth on Twitter as well. But I was just grateful that you reached out because it's a great conversation to have. And I think I shared with you as you were pre-gaming that what shook me up, right, was your tweet about, how everyone is excited for Shang-Chi to come out later on this year, and everyone wants our money, right? Not only as an Asian American community, but also everyone else. But again, being able to recognize that and protect and honor that community, right? And so I think that's why it was good to have this conversation today.
Yeah. So obviously, like, what Jedi is referring to is like I think in a couple of months, like we're gonna get the first Asian driven MCU film in Shang-Chi. And first of all, rest in peace to Chadwick Boseman, who basically is what made that possible, and I know how much the Asian community and Asian American community owes to him just for that film's existence, because it's proof of concept, right? Like that you can make a like authentically ethnic MCU film and
Right.
make that meaningful. And because of that, like, my people will get a chance, and I'm very hopeful, like what we talked about before the show, that you and Hispanic Latinx folks will also see very similar representation, because even if such a thing feels silly, it's not important for somebody to see that they can be capable of something big or worth basing narratives around. And
Absolutely.
with the news this week of Minari like winning and being in the awards conversation, and Frontierland, I think is the name of the other one, right? Like there's major work that's being made by Asian Americans that is deemed worthy of critical praise from the art community, but our lives aren't. And they want our money, but they don't want to acknowledge our humanity. And I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about a lot of different things over the next hour plus that we go, just in terms of the history of anti-Asian racism to kind of how that's playing out today. So, we'll kind of play it by ear, but that's, I'm really grateful that you've given me a platform to talk a little bit about all that stuff.
It's a pleasure and an honor just to be able to talk with you as always, and being able to be part of this because, like you said, I don't know how to help. I don't know how to be part of the conversation. All it's just being able to magnify the message. So I'm glad to hear that. And I'm glad you were thinking about kind of giving us an overview, right? Because I just wanted to hear your thoughts. Obviously, both of us having been from the Bay Area, and we during World War II heard about the Japanese internment camps as well. But what were some of the things that you were thinking about as to from a historical perspective and getting us to where we're at now?
Yeah, I think maybe like what people are not familiar with. So at times, I think part of this will feel lectury. I'm a high school teacher, so it's just it is gonna be what it is, right? That's just how I deliver information.
Let me start taking notes.
But the truth of it is, like, what happened this week in Atlanta, uh, the loss of life that's happened there is really something that I'm not proud to say that I've seen coming for a long
Mm.
time.
Okay.
Um, the signs of anti-Asian racism have been, like, okayed and green-lighted by the previous presidential administration. Um, I'm sure that you felt that as a Hispanic person, that, like, the degree of intensity of, like, animosity towards your community has only amplified over the last 5 years, right?
Right.
Like, and Asians are about to go through something like that over the next 10 to 15, and it's complicated. So there'll be things that I think I'll share tonight that seem at odds with other things, but
Hmm.
that really is the history of Asian American and anti-Asian racism. Like, if you try to find kind of a coherent, like, consistent thread through that, like,
Hmm.
it just doesn't exist. The same
Mm.
way that you can kind of see, like, the the racism that's committed against Black folks that exists to this day is
Right.
very different, because you can trace a line from that through slavery, and then Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow, and then civil rights, and all the way
Right.
today to, like, quote unquote, right, like, but there is no coherent narrative like that for Asian folks. And what I mean by that is we are hyper visible in the collective at
Hmm.
times, and we are invisible in the collective at times as well. We've been co-opted into the white American supremacy project at times,
Hmm.
and at this exact moment we're being kicked out of that. But, like, where we used to be second, and now, and that's not something I endorse. I want to make that very clear. Like, that places, whiteness as the most powerful thing in this country, and then Asian Americans and Asians as, like, white adjacent. Like, I don't
Okay.
endorse that structure, but I recognize that it is, like, very fluid, and at this moment, the system is reacting towards Asians in a very violent fashion. And when you add all that up, you get kind of like a narrative that doesn't always make sense. Like, we are a lot of things because we're a lot of different people.
Hmm. Absolutely. And that's the interesting thing with that, right? Is that because I mean it's just having been around, it's just especially in the areas where the violence is happening here in the Bay Area, right? And so forth, just being able to see the frequency of the attacks in some place that, a community that has been so key, critical, and crucial to the development of this area, right? And just part of the culture itself, right? It's just this San Francisco wouldn't be what it is without the influx of, Asian the history of people coming in from China and the Far East, as they will, bringing in and building the infrastructure, this town, even the railroads, they were part of it, right? So it's just, it baffles me that it's coming back, or and again, maybe again, just like maybe it's always just bubbling under this. It's always been bubbling under the surface, and then all of a sudden, because someone poured some gasoline and a little match on it, it just it came to head.
Yeah, and I think right now, when I started by thinking about it, like, as increasing and maybe possibly getting worse in the next, like, 10, 15 years, I think a lot of it is going to be driven by China's rising status as a geopolitical power. And
Okay.
I'm not qualified to talk about this in depth. Like, I'm not like, that's not my area of expertise as much as kind of the interpretive framework of how to look at all this. But
Right.
I think that kind of anxiety, right,
Mm-hmm.
like, motivates a lot of American government. It certainly did under the last administration, which is why you get away with being able to call it the Kung flu, and that stuff has real consequences for
Mm-hmm.
real life people.
Absolutely. It's actually very interesting you're saying that, right? Because I mean, for decades, I mean, I listened to this old show. I mentioned it before, Art Bell. He was a huge AM talk radio, and he always talked about the paranormal, right? He did politics very early on in his career, but focused on paranormal, UFOs, all this other stuff. But he made trips to China in the mid to late 90s, right? He said it was just impressive how it was growing. And I think that's a very interesting point that you make, because China is becoming a superpower, and they are going to, and if everything continues to go on, they may very well eclipse us economically if they continue to grow, and that's a very viable possibility, right? Given how American innovation is kind of like, I don't want to say lacking, but it just doesn't feel as fast as how it's occurring in China. And so I think that's definitely something, like you said, all the USA number one types are going to see, you know, Asian Americans as a threat, right? I think that's a very unique point that I didn't even think about.
And if we trace this backwards, right, like this idea of Asians as a threat, like it starts very early in the 1850s when the first Chinese get here, like a legal system. And I only know this because I taught this specifically during, to my high school students when we were studying history of immigration. Like in 1854, People versus Hall essentially set up the precedent that Chinese people were grouped in with non-whites, so
Hmm.
native and black folks. Like the testimony of a Chinese man, like was set up as like lesser than that of a white man, so it's not admissible in court.
Right.
And you see this thread that kind of goes through history from that point, where Asian folks are a threat. Like Chinese people are then like, we can't have more coming, and that's why we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is policy unofficially up until the 50s and 60s when they
Hmm.
when they finally like remodel like American
Right.
immigration. And there's so much of it that shifts in between that 1880s to 1920s period, because as soon as China becomes our ally in world wars, then you have Japanese folk who assume that mantle of like the Asian threat.
Right.
And today, we aren't really seeing that idea of
Mhm.
Asians as threats to America. That yellow peril like strain of narrative that runs through this is only
Right.
coming up again now with COVID, and is likely to be retied back to China in the future, because there was a healthy block of time in between the 60s till now where the biggest threats that Asian American folks are to America is in their elite academic institutions due to
Hmm.
the model minority myth.
Right. And that's actually, and it's just, again, why, you mentioned this about some of the acts in the 1800s. For those of you, I love the movie Tombstone, right? And in there's a Sheriff Behan. He introduces himself to Wyatt Earp, extends his hand. He says, I'm, local sheriff, leader of the fire brigade, and chairman of the anti-Chinese committee. I'm like, but I mean, it's just, that's something that is part of the history that truly someone may have had back then, that is still part, like you said, it's, even though it's mentioned in passing, it's something that you should glom onto. It's just, there's still those bits of information that you really have to be sensitive to and realize that, hey, it's always unfortunately been around in some form or another. Now, my question for you is, and again, before you, do you think, obviously you were talking about how the previous administration it definitely intensified this. Do you think it was because um, the coming over of COVID solidified it, or do you think there was something? What was it before COVID? Do you think that it was just fan the flames, if you will?
I think that's exactly it. Like the idea that we have an event that we can credibly trace its origin to the Far East, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think that, and watching it like pick up in
Mm-hmm.
November and December, and seeing people in Wuhan like in lockdown, right? And not thinking that it's going to come over here or cause that kind of like global impact, I think has allowed this sentiment to really fester and develop, right? And then you add the fact
Right.
that people are indoors all the time, consuming more and more of this type of narrative, this type of vitriol, like uh, that is kind of how you spell out, I think, the ingredients for what happens this week.
Mm. And that was, and again, that's just, and again, it was just the attacks in Atlanta of being
Yeah.
horrific, and then albeit it was the way they were talking, it was on its way. He was on his way to Florida to do some more. There was a couple. There's a lot of horrific things. Mostly, most importantly, the deaths of. Is it the count up to 8 now?
Yeah, I believe that's what it is at my last, what I've seen last.
Right, because there was 6 women, and then or were they all women? I don't remember if there was 2 that were clients of the massage. I just can't remember that. But I mean, it's just I was trying to remember the breakdown of that because I just wanted to make sure that's what it was. But again, clearly he, as everyone here on this call this show has heard, and again, this is the more infuriating part. And again, this is probably the dismissive part of it. He's having a bad day, right? That police chief kind of dismissed it, right, when it was just something else. But any more information on the shooter, right? Beyond him having a sexual addiction, was there any addiction? Was there anything else
I
as to that
think,
person's history?
like, and I think this is where it gets tricky, right? Like, you and I, as people of color, can immediately like look at the numbers and indicate, well, like, I don't need to be a mathematician or a detective to see that these things seem to be related.
Absolutely.
Because the fact that you can even say that you have a sex addiction to take out on Asian women, and I've seen reports both ways, so I didn't actually get it confirmed for myself, like whether or not whether they're sex workers or not, right? Like, they still deserve the right to humanity.
Absolutely.
So, but the fact that he like finds Asian women to be that like target, right? Like, again, when I started at the top, I'm like, there are going to be a lot of really complex like narratives that sometimes don't seem to make sense with each other, but Asian Americans encompass like a lot of different countries and a lot of different stories of how they got here. And I think all of that, yeah, like sex addiction does not cause people to commit terrorism
Amen to
or
that.
murder. Like, hi, Miss B.
Absolutely.
I'm reading the comments in the stream.
You should. And for everyone else that's not, I mean, this is exactly what we saw,
Yeah.
Just exactly it.
And so
And the other thing is too, is
yeah.
that so he happened to do it in one swath, right? Just one. But if he was able to murder 8 Asian women, he'd be a serial killer, right? So I mean, it doesn't matter the duration. It's like there is a trend, there is a pattern, and that's exactly what it is. And it needs, and it is a domestic terrorism. It is absolute domestic terrorism because he was out there to create terror.
What, like, the sex addiction thing gives you plausible deniability, I think, in a lot of people's eyes, because for mainstream America, and I'm not talking about necessarily the people who may be listening to this conversation right now, but for mainstream America, we have only progressed far enough to recognize a very precisely defined set of characteristics that we will recognize as racist. So, for example, if you do not say that exact slur, but you say something that's around it, like, you're okay. And
it's that YouTube case. Did you see that? There's a guy that he has a whole entire show on YouTube, has millions of followers and tens of millions of views. But because he doesn't say I hate X, it doesn't fall within YouTube's bucket. So like, he's fine, which it's not.
And ironically, you could have been describing any one of multiple like right-wing figureheads like here. So when we're talking about that, like Asians, what I want to make clear to the audience that maybe they already know, right? Like, is that Asians very most often suffer from a kind of racism that is under that cover of plausible deniability, because people do not want to grant us the humanity to have racism to commit against, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So, for example, the fact that I'll speak first in terms of like how that applies to this situation in Atlanta, and then maybe on a more personal level.
Okay.
Like the fact that mainstream media has not learned how to pronounce the names of these folk, right? Like does not care to know their stories, does not care to
Hmm.
humanize them in the same way that we will the shooter, does not care to make excuses for them in the same way that we will people who are violent. Um, like that type of racism like has always been allowed to be committed against Asian folk because uh, mainstream America sees us and maybe even like from the other side of this too, like from folks that have maybe less privileges, they see that as just something that you're supposed to endure because some of
Hmm.
us got to elevate ourselves like academically, and some Asians got financial success in America, that's just like a tax that you pay, and
Hmm.
racism against us isn't taken seriously. I think for that reason.
Right. This is kind of what when you were saying those words, it's almost like a passive aggressive racism, right? It's like, okay, this and that, but you just want to be able to not be able to have to, like you said, they're going to, those outside forces, those, I don't even want to say humans, but those people that conduct that press that racism out, right? They don't want, like you said, they don't want to be, they still want to be racist towards, because again, there's some sort of hatred or jealousy, whatever else it's because again of your community's very visible success, right? Not only at all levels, right? So it's again, it's just again, well, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and, like you said, continue to do that. But that's fascinating. Like you said, it's kind of a tax that you have to, that you, the community has to pay, which is again, why do you have to get taxed twice? The government's trying to fuck you twice.
And then on top of that, like besides the fact that we like have that like that narrative of uh, Asian Americans are successful isn't even true for every group. It's like widely disparate, like our results and our
Mm-hmm.
outcomes based on which wave of immigration we came from, where we came from, and when in American history like we chose to arrive.
Mm.
So, for example, the and this is verifiable, like the median income for an Indian American household is significantly higher than that of other Asians from, say, Laos or Thailand, because the first major wave of immigration of Indian immigration was skilled laborers who then took up high-paying tech jobs,
Mm.
and again, for that very similar reason, Indian Americans have I believe it's twice as high of a 4-year graduation rate from college as or as Vietnamese folk. So, given all of that, like this idea that we should all have to pay this price and accept this racism and not say anything about it
Hmm.
because some of us were successful, is just that it's not true uh, overall. Like there are many Asian households that do not get to claim a lot of the same luxuries, and those are the folks who unfortunately like become the targets much more easily in the Bay
Right.
Area or in Atlanta.
Nope, that's exactly it, right? And it is, and that's an interesting thing because I kind of wanted to think about it as well because of the Indian community, right? And again, I to be honest, here in my town, right, it's actually very interesting because I think I'm the third, I'm the fourth largest community because it's there, it's white, and then I believe it's Asian, and then Indian, and then myself, right? It's just because again there has been such a influx of Indian families here in my town in the last 5 years. So it's interesting to be, it's interesting to see that. But it's just like you said, it's interesting the way you paint that, right? It's just how they come in and just having that, you know, academic success and being a little bit. But I'm just curious. It's just given what the Indian community is experiencing, is that something that the Asian community is encountering? Are they going to see something like? Are they going to see something like that? And I don't know.
So just to make sure that I understood
I
like
painted a super complicated picture. I'm sorry.
so you're asking whether like Indian Americans are likely to see what Chinese and East Asians are
Correct.
seeing. I think that's actually a really great question, and if you didn't bring it up, that would have been one of the points that I wanted to make,
Good.
which
Okay.
is that Asia is such a vastly like large place
It
that all
is.
of a sudden, some of these groups are enjoying privileges that they did not have a couple of months ago,
Hmm.
which is to say that due to physical markers and skin color and those kinds of things, people can tell enough, like, to have a picture of what somebody from East Asia looks like. They may
Mhm.
not be able to tell the difference between Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, but what you will be able to do is just like identify, okay, that's the area of the world that they're from, and South Asians can kind of like in this moment. Be out of view. And when I talk about how the narrative of Asian history has been both hyper visibility and invisibility, in this
Mhm.
moment, it's South Asians who are, you know, able to kind of, I don't want to say slide by, but they are not like what's in the crosshairs at this moment.
South Asian meaning which
Like
country?
South Asian, meaning Indian, Bangladesh. Like I don't know if that's still. So I'm not good enough at but like that
That
region,
region out there, yeah,
like yeah, uh,
exactly.
but when we're talking about that, I'm kind of like I'm kind of like in the middle of all of this because Vietnam is Southeast Asia. If you go to certain parts of China, you will find people who look like me.
Mhm.
But if most people run into me on the street, they'll think Filipino maybe, and
Okay,
so
which I
it
get.
puts, yeah, it puts me in a very interesting spot. And uh but my mom doesn't look quite like me. She's a little bit lighter skinned, so somebody could feasibly think that she's Chinese, and
Mhm.
that is something that part only it only threatens some parts of the Asian population right now, for sure.
Right. Exactly. No, and that's curious. And just to your point about, Asian continent being massive, I have two dear friends from Lebanon, and one of them, he's like, "Yeah, I'm Asian because that's part. Even though we call it Middle East, that's still part of
Yeah,
that same continent. But yeah, but it's like I said, that's very curious. But back to, you know, and I know I took a tangent at talking about the Indian community as well, but
no,
just wanted to bring it back to, you know, just I just I wish I knew. It's interesting too because sometimes we're always having conversation as of what the catalyst was, right? And it's just
mm,
having. He's kind of like, oh, okay, I had a sex addiction, right? But it wasn't anything else. But like the attack in San Francisco yesterday, she beat. There was an elderly woman got attacked, got punched in the eye, I believe, but she ended up beating the shit out of her assaulter to the point where he had to get taken away in a stretcher. And that was actually a thing of beauty. But I believe her story just came across on Twitter, and so I believe there's a GoFundMe and everything else for her. But it's again, it's almost this passive aggressive racism. You never hear as to what their motivation was, and I think that's what's bothersome, right? Because either one, they're not letting these harassers speak, or maybe they're just manipulating the narrative. I don't know.
yeah, it's like it just with this week alone, right? Like, oh, he's having a bad day, and then you have the announcer in Oklahoma who like slurs into a hot mic,
Right.
and he's able to blame that on his blood sugar, right? Like, it feels almost as if the bar for accountability for racism is slipping even precariously lower than it was
Right.
like a week ago, and this is troubling to me for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And all you have to do, and this is like a problem with kind of like race blind analyses, because I've done some reading with my classes, as to how the legal system was able to, produce racist outcomes without racist language,
Right.
essentially. uh, you have a very similar thing. Like, as long as that person, and it's like legal precedent, and you can read about this in The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
Book plug. You're welcome, Michelle Alexander. Um, like, like when you see that, like, and you see it laid out that essentially, as long as you don't say race is a factor, they can't reasonably attach
Right.
that to you. And I think most people are smart enough to do that now. And because if they're catching you, it's gonna be on like often private social media
Mm-hmm.
accounts, or things that you didn't think people knew about sometimes, unless you're just really,
Right.
really sloppy with it. Like, they're not going to catch you being a racist unless you reveal it.
The real dumb ones are the ones that are sloppy.
Yeah,
But
that's
it's the
exactly
more
it.
it's and those are the ones that are always going to be easy to catch as it is, right? But again, it's a matter of, okay, being able to, and again, that just the power of the internet and forums and social media and all this other stuff gives these keyboard commandos the privacy of being able to do that. And so that's always this just again thinking back when online getting online first, right, back in the mid to late 90s, there was still some sort of accountability. But then again, just because again then people started realizing, oh, there is some true anonymity to this. There is no way someone can track me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let my dark side bubble up and do however I want. And I think that's just there's always been numerous articles about trolls and being able to do all that other stuff. So it's just as Paul was saying, you know what? It's unfortunately I don't know why it has to get worse, but it just before it gets better. But I don't look forward to it getting worse.
Yeah, I mean, like this week, I sat down, like, and at least taking the temperature in my local,
Mm-hmm.
like, Asian community, we've seen varying degrees of like how seriously folks take it. I think Asian Americans, folks who have grown up here and much more intimately understand the social systems that are kind of in place for this and the history of how it's transpired, we take it a lot more seriously than our parents who come
Right.
here, especially if we're the first generation who's born here. Our parents very often have extremely pro-American views because they believe very much
Mm-hmm.
in the promise of America,
Right.
and they followed the playbook of America, sometimes to great success. And it's hard to reconcile that for them, or even like the additional layers, like to communicate that to them if you're not a certain level of fluent in your parents'
Right.
tongue.
Exactly. And I think that's so I'm first generation as well. Actually, I think I'm one and a half because my dad was first generation, but my mom immigrated, naturalized in 70. So
Mhm,
70. So I'm one and a half. But
mhm.
I absolutely see what you're saying, right? Where there's that generation where it's like, no, this is the dream, this is the vision, this is how you do it. Right. And that's what you're supposed to stick to. But again, I think it just seems like this ever ending. It's a cancer that gets some treatment but never gets ripped out, right? And so that's why every single generation for some reason are continually dealing with this in some form or another, right? And it's just it's a no it's infuriating to still see in our country now, given everything that we can do, it's still around. And I just don't know. I wish there was a way to just change it all. Obviously we do that every generation, but I just yeah, at times I'm just at a loss for words.
It is it's deeply troubling. Like I remember being in college and reading various novelists, because a novel is kind of like a laboratory for an idea,
Mm-hmm.
and reading various novelists like think about race and seeing how in a modern context that those ideas either still apply or that their answers were not correct.
Right.
And I'm thinking about, like, for example, like this hope that like it's generational, and so the next generation is going to be that group that deals with racism and fixes it and knows better. But these things are reproducible, very much, and so that's why I like the cancer metaphor. It's just it can and will reproduce unchecked.
Mm-hmm. And it continues to grow, and it's again for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure if this is something that has to happen at the federal level, right, or is this something more of a grassroots where it just absolutely has to shake up? Because I mean, even the movements at Cal, right, as pronounced and verbal and as vocal as they were, right, there was some change that came out of it. But again, just to have that kind of sweeping change again is what we're looking at, right? But I mean, yes, there's some change looking in there, and obviously, like you were talking about representation, right? So there's been some shows like movies we're looking at, but then there have been some TV shows. I mean, I remember back when I was younger, the only Hispanic that I think I remember seeing on TV were two guys. Obviously, it was Chico and the Man, so that was Freddie Prince, right? And then there was another one. He recently passed. His name was Jose Garcia. He was on another show called Barney Miller, right? So those were some in the late 70s. So it's like, okay, that you saw the Hispanic last name, but it wasn't, and then, it kind of grew in, obviously Cheech and Chong were, they're bubbling around, but it's just the representation's always important because it really wasn't until, the late 90s, right, where you kind of saw some of the other, like, it was like you saw, like, George Lopez coming out. Before him, Paul Rodriguez had a TV show, but that didn't stick for some reason. Again, it had a very similar formula, but it
Yeah.
just didn't stick when it was in the early 90s, right? And even then, it wasn't until the late 90s, 2000. Thank you, Gregory Sierra on Barney Miller. But it wasn't until the late 90s, maybe even 2000s, that Emilio Estevez is actually, Hispanic to it was his mom, right? And even though I think it's Carlos and Emilio, I think Charlie Sheen's real name is Carlos, right? So it was, getting that type of representation is important. Back to what you were saying about the movie, right? So I just wanted to come back to that. It's like,
Yeah.
do you think, right? Because obviously, such how amazing Black Panther was for representation and just to be able to have such a strong, powerful character and make it part of a hero like that part of the mainstream, right? That's what
Yeah.
I'm hoping for Shang-Chi as well. So do you think that, is there still good Asian representation on TV and in the media, or do you think that this Shang-Chi is going to be the one that's going to kind of make it bigger and better?
So, in terms of the media representation thing, and I want to get this out of the way first before I answer the
Please.
question. So, if I forget to directly address the question, just like I recognize that Asians as a people, right, up until this week, really, like, weren't forced to reckon with other issues in the community except, you know, like, weren't really forced to reckon with much besides that issue of representation most visibly. I recognize the immense privilege that we have in that,
Right.
and that's always been something that hasn't sat well with me to think like, is this the most pressing that and that is why I very much believe in allyship and showing up and working on the plight of other communities because we do enjoy certain things.
Right.
Um, so it is a luxury to be able to have this conversation as our primary worry again up until this week.
Right.
Uh, do I think that Shang-Chi is going to usher in a kind of a big change for the way that Asian folks are represented in media, which I think ultimately, short of educating racists directly, is still one of the best ways in which you can,
Mhm.
humanize people. Is to tell stories and is to make art. Um, I would say that this is something that really you can follow back to a couple of years ago. I think 2019. You have Crazy Rich Asians, which is a
Mhm.
studio gamble that goes well. You have The Farewell, and I remember being in the movie theater the night in LA. Here at the ArcLight Hollywood, the night that that Crazy Rich Asians, I almost said Pretty Little Liars. But Crazy Rich Asians came out, and there's like there's just this tenseness that's in the air from everybody who's Asian that is there, uh, because we know by looking at each other just wordlessly, like we know we have to make this succeed because if
Mhm.
it doesn't, it will be another 20 years before they see our stories as worth telling.
Got it.
And we're lucky that became a movie that people liked and it greenlighted other projects like
Mhm.
Minari and I want to also shout out Stephen Yeun here for his role in The Walking Dead. That while I haven't seen that show, I know it's been a lot of other people's first like exposure to kind of an Asian male lead, and I don't want to discount the work that John Cho and everybody before that has happened. But really, if you want to start talking about this, I think the modern like era of Asian representation is going to find its roots here when we first were able to back up Crazy Rich Asians. And that comes with its own problems too, because I literally have like well-meaning liberal, like voted for Obama twice people, no offense to people who vote, but like there's a certain well-meaningness of it that forces me to also once again like confront like this very casual racism about like, so are you
Mm,
one of them crazy rich ones? Like,
yeah,
Asia is a continent that is rich with stories that do not only involve like grossly opulent, and that's discomforting for me to watch, right? Like, I
yeah,
recognize both the importance of the project, so I'm there in the movie, but I'm also deeply bothered thinking about American, like, you know, I don't want American people to think this is all that exists out there in Asia, or that there's only war stories and things like that.
right. And there's a ton of stories. Like you said, it's very interesting too, because I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed Crazy Rich Asians because it was a story that was familiar, separate from the setting, right? Separate from everything else. It's like, okay, yeah, I absolutely get that because you can always have, you know, a mom like that in any sort of community that has that opinion of this girl that wants to marry her son and so forth, right? It just again for me, I was able to connect on it because again, you know, the lead actress coming from a single mom, having a single mom family and everything else, that's exactly what Mrs. Jedi ASU came from. So again, it was just very relatable on multiple levels, separate from where the story came from. And I think that's why it made it such, I think that's why it was a good story, right? And I think that was it. But Paul Hornstein back on here remembered this, and this is something that I always like to remember. And it's like a lot of ancestors that came to this country were not wanted, right? I remember. I mean, that's
That's
definitely
true.
that's you know, I mean, obviously there's particular, you know, there's the whole, you know, the Italian families, right? They came in, right? And it's just like there was all kinds of groups in there that, you know, for some reason, and I can't explain it why or what happened, right? But for some reason, they're no longer considered those minority. They're not no longer Irish. They're no longer Porcelain.
Yeah.
They're not Italian, right? So it's just again, maybe it's because again from a genetic perspective, they're able to
Yeah.
blend in a little bit more easily than, you know, say we can, right?
Yeah.
And again, that may be that's the only reason, right? But again, like you said, I think to Paul's point, it's something that so
Yeah.
many people forget.
And actually, I'm glad that Paul brought that up because, like, that's exactly true, right? Like, a lot of immigrant groups suffered, right? And I'm only trying to make the case that Asian suffering is its own, like, separate and distinct vein because
Right.
there's no path to, like, mainstream acceptance in the same way that a lot of other European groups got to have.
Hmm.
Um, like, for example, and again, like, not just the genetic thing, but it leads to certain assumptions, right? People's is codified like image of me is going to be that I must be from somewhere, that no matter how perfect my English may or may not be, like the default assumption for folks like you and me, and maybe not even you as much sometimes, no, like, because you're like a, you know, in certain places, I think, could do the Charlie Sheen thing.
I got
Um,
a story for you, by the way. So go ahead.
yeah. Like, I think that it's not likely to go for Asian folks the way that it did for Irish folks or that it did for Greeks, and that is not to discount the suffering that those groups like had.
Exactly. And we're definitely not trying to discount it, right? It's just, again, it's definitely a longer road that, you know, Asian Americans are going to have to be on. And I mean, it's just, and for as long as Asian Americans have been immigrating into the US, they're still on that road, right? Where some other groups were able to, you know, get on an off ramp or elevate it up or wherever else it was, right? But we're still trudging on that same exact road, and then they're just, you know, having to deal with those rocks being lobbed at them or whatever else it may be that's keeping them on that path, despite, you know, successes and efforts to be part of it, right? And I think that's just, and it's interesting too because I have a relative who is extremely conservative, right? And she's very fair skinned, but she was born in Nogales, Arizona. Well,
Mhm.
actually, she was born in Tucson, but her grandmother came from Nogales, Mexico, and came over to Nogales, Arizona. But during the election, she continually called herself Spanish. She disavowed the Mexican portion for that. And so it was just very interesting to just that, even that close, right, to be able to do that. So anyway, it's just, for some people it's going to be easier than most. And and those of us that have to deal with it, right? It's just, I don't look forward to it getting worse, but I just don't know how we're going to make it better. Because for me, for some of you have met me, I'm 6'4". So when I'm driving around, when I'm even walking around, I still feel like I could be seen as a threat. And so I'm just I've never walked around like that until recently. In all my years, and my true age, and I'm not going to reveal that on the show. But for all those years I've been on this planet, it wasn't only until recently that I'm like, okay, I'm concerned for my safety, right? And all the Padawans, they all inherited their mom's fair skin. Mrs. Jedi, she's from Tucson just like me, but she has extremely fair skin. So the Padawans are even lighter than us. So I'm like, I tell them, it's like, man, you guys aren't going to experience any of that. Even here when we're in town, in this town that I live in, you're not going to experience what, even me and my mom did. But anyway.
No, I totally agree with that. Like, I think I don't fault any group or any individual who chooses to, because if you have that luxury, I can imagine why somebody would be tempted to take that or to fold themselves. And the history of America is full of folks who didn't identify with their ethnic group, but chose to kind of adopt themselves into the product, or into the project rather, of white supremacy. Like, starting with the Uncle Tom stereotype, like the house slave thing. Like, white supremacy requires willing, complicit actors from the group, right? Like, from the group that it seeks domination over, I think.
And that's kind of just, again, something that unfortunately it's like, and it's almost, I don't know, and I guess I really don't care how it is in other countries, right? Because again, but I mean, because we're here, right? But it's almost as if that's where there's always some sort, you have to be complicit in some form or another to be with the majority, if you will. And that's just, is that really going to become human nature? I mean, we've talked about this and doing interstellar travel and all that. Are we seriously going to have to deal with that when we colonize Mars and all these other planets? Or is it,
or when Mars comes to colonize us? Like, like, when do we see ourselves as a human race, right? Like, maybe, fingers crossed, like I think I floated, like when we talked about that, maybe it's gonna have to be an interstellar like threat. And not to make this too dark, right? But if climate change is not yet enough of a motivator to get us to like cooperate and see ourselves as a group, like, it's gonna have to be bigger than that. And the only thing I can think of right now is aliens.
Right. And I think it's even then, I mean, with world wars, right? I mean, we didn't blow each other to bits within the world wars, but again, it just definitely solidified some of the separate, the us versus them, unfortunately. And so, it has to be a threat greater than us. And it's crazy how that gets to that as well. I mean, I read World Wars. Have you read World War Z?
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
I gushed about that book for a few days. I mean, I consumed it in probably a span of maybe 12 hours. It was the fastest I've ever read a book, and I absolutely adored it. And I'm going to reread it again, but it was again about the zombie plague. It originated in China, and how it just kind of paints a picture of what everyone went through. And so it was just curious to see, even though after that there was still pockets of humanity facing the challenge on their own, instead of, like you said, uniting, because it was a global threat that everyone decided to take on their own. And it just, something from the outside is just, it's a shame. And I think it was, what was it? Oh, there's a movie back in the late 80s, and it was Alien Nation. I don't know if you saw that one, but it was, again, kind of like District 9, right? These aliens came down, and they thought it was angels and everything else, but it wasn't. And so all of a sudden, these aliens that were part of the society now were the lower class, right? So it just magnified the racism and everything else. So it was just, anyway, that was just kind of like, I wish it was a way to see it foreseeable. I wish there was a foreseeable way to just see it getting over this, right? Because it's so asinine.
I think, and this is a good place for me to kind of like do my closing like thing, which is that we ultimately have a limited like level of impact that we can have like on this thing, and I think the choice to apply that like positively or negatively is up to us. But it's the multiplicative like
Mm-hmm.
force of organizing, right?
Right.
Of reaching out and making these kinds of connections, right? Like I can talk about what we just talked about among my people, like and I've done that work, and this week I'm able to convince my mom to like, yo, like they do not care that you're not Chinese. I promise you, like they don't know that.
Yeah.
Like I'm able to get that through to her, and so we do the work within our own communities,
Mm-hmm.
but we also have to do the work across communities to bring this
Absolutely.
kind of stuff to other platforms, which really tells like. And that's ultimately why I'm really happy to be here, and hopefully that I'm talking to some people about something that they've never seen, and just the chance to kind of let folks know that, hey, Asian folks like have suffered and will suffer from the impact of racism. They have for 170 years, and they're going to, and just giving us places and opportunities for us to have that heard. I think today you were a plus, Jedi, is what I'm saying in terms of the fight to end racism. So
Thank you.
I'm really grateful for that opportunity.
Good. No, I appreciate it. So I wanted to bounce something else off you. I saw something that came across my timeline one time. It was stop, you know, stop anti, stop Asian hate, right? I think is
Hmm.
what it was. And someone came across my timeline and someone said stop all hate. And it
Yeah.
kind of chapped my ass, right? Because I was like, look, it's kind of like I kind of got sensitive about it because it's like it's not that
For the very
black
same reasons. Yep.
it's not that black lives matter more. It's just they matter, so you got to stop fucking killing black people. And that's the same thing. You got to stop fucking hating on Asian people. It's not more important, it's not more, it's not less. It's just you got to cut that, people have got to cut that shit out. And so it just chapped my ass. And so your thoughts on that, if you see it on your timeline, I mean,
Quite
was my
frankly,
reaction okay, or is it?
no, absolutely.
Well, obviously it's mine, but I mean your thoughts.
No, like I think that that's perfectly right to see those as the same. Like anybody who takes this moment, right, this very, very absurdly rare moment when Asians are even granted enough visibility to air out some of this history and to walk people through a fraction of almost 2 decades of kind of invisible suffering
Hmm.
that we've just been kind of pushed around, the American hierarchy. Because when it's convenient, right? Elevated when it's convenient, demoted when it's convenient,
Yeah.
like punished, like as victims of the political moment. I think that it's totally fair to be mad at that and to see that as uh, like in the very same vein of like in trying to immediately invalidate the speaking of that experience. Like
Hmm.
I'd see that as the same. And at this point, after Black Lives Matter has been in the national consciousness for almost 5 years, I think, like anybody who is still ignorant to that at this point has either uh, like no intellectual curiosity to find out, or they have a vested interest in not understanding it.
Okay. And I think that's probably the case, right? They're just not interested in understanding it, which is just even more upsetting, right? Because again, that's like you said, doing the work not only within our community, but outside of our community. And so that's kind of one of the things I'd like to brainstorm with you. How do we go ahead and start obviously doing shows like this and talking about it across our community? But what else? And again, do you have any initial ideas on how we can spread the word across communities?
I think one of the biggest things, like if you live in a place, because I talked about this with my students this week, like you live in a place where you're not likely to see that many Asian people on a day-to-day basis. Like, nobody is asking you to go out and physically defend us, like if somebody comes around in Chinatown, although that would be very nice. Like, you should not be a bystander if that happens.
Exactly.
I think some of the best ways for you to do that is to do the work in your own communities. If you see people committing microaggressions or using Orientalist language or kind of looking at Asian women in problematic ways, like in the classroom, one of the strategies that they teach you in teaching school, which is not really called that. There's no teaching school, but like
Teaching School 102A.
they do teach you, like, each one teach one, right? Like, the sign of your success is whether you're able, your comprehension is whether you're able to teach that or reproduce that for somebody else.
Right.
So I see the question that's in the chat, so I want to take this before I get out of your hair for today.
Sure.
Yes, I think that is one of multiple answers to this question, right? Like, the justification of the racism comes from the fact that they feel outcompeted, but it also comes from like trying to maintain the privileges that you already have. Nobody ever surrenders power willingly. That's just not how these transitions work. So the changing demographics of America is not only rooted in the economic parts of that, like, change, but just, that means educational change, that means competition in the housing market, and whether there are issues with the fact that so much of American society is competition and capitalist based, that's a conversation for another pod.
Right.
But I think that's definitely one of the, like, economic anxiety is not a meme, but it's not the primary answer when racism is.
It almost feels like, and again, this is something that I've encountered recently and that I've noticed in myself, and it just begins to feel, it's almost a sense of lack, right? Meaning people have just such a strong sense of lack, meaning I am without, meaning I want to have and I don't have. I am worried about what I don't have, and if someone's going to come in, they are going to reduce my chances of having that. And I think it's just a whole mindset of lack. And I think to your point, I think if we just go ahead and speak of abundance, then you're just like, okay, there's people are earning, you got Bezos earning billions of dollars. And if he were to pay off the national debt and buy some countries, he'd still have billions of dollars. There's money, there's success, there's homes, there's food, there's everything out there for everyone, instead of having to hate on someone and saying you're going to take it away from me. So
I have one question for you before we get off the air, just because I want us to close on kind of like bringing it back to what brought us together, which is just being general nerds, right?
Please.
You're wearing a Mandalorian shirt.
Yes.
I have a Disney Plus subscription.
Yes.
I haven't watched the series yet. I've heard good things, but I just kind of want your, like, elevator pitch take. Like, what should I anticipate? Like, obviously you probably love it, but I'd like to kind of get your quick take on that.
The Mandalorian expands the Star Wars galaxy in a handful of episodes you wish the movies did.
Ooh. So is it kind of like, since you know how much I love, like, God, the name of the movie is escaping me right now. Rogue One, right? Like, you know how much I love Rogue One. My semi-controversial in some circles. Like,
that's
Rogue
my
One
number one. That's one of my number ones.
So it's kind of like in that vein. It's like it's closer to like something that pushes the universe out in a meaningful direction.
Yes, it absolutely does. Because again, there was a TV series idea that George Lucas had back in the early 2000s and developed it. And it was supposed to be the underworld of Coruscant. And it never came to be. But a lot of those elements you see in The Mandalorian. And so obviously the big reveal is and everything else has to deal with this guy. But,
Thank you, by the way, for not spoiling that for me. I've only picked up a few things, so I just it's a relatively unspoiled experience for me right now.
And the interesting thing is, even though that is such a huge element of it, right? It's just the whole arc as to how it's just the journey of the Mandalorian it just not only you see it, but you also see how much bigger this universe is, but how impactful the Empire was. And so you'll have to, and again, it's interesting. Yeah, I will have to have a whole thing after you binge watch the whole series,
Yeah,
because it was just
that's actually good enough for me to definitely check it out real soon. We have spring break coming up, so I might just tear through the Mandalorian.
yeah. And that whole
Jedi.
description and that whole
Oh
description was definitely on the fly, so I didn't mean to do that. So,
no,
d-
that was perfect. That
but
sold me very well.
but I thank you for being on here, man, and I appreciate you sharing. Did I give you enough time to be able to share all the points you wanted? Did I take you in the right
Yes.
direction and everything else? Because I
Yeah,
just
like
wanted to make sure.
I wrote a notes sheet like on my other monitor. I
Oh,
recently
good.
upgraded. So I've said a lot. I want to thank you for the airspace to kind of share one perspective from the Asian American community on all this. Stop Asian hate, but even more importantly, to you and the folks who's listening to this, like uh, hear us, right? Like and see us. Like you, don't just stop hating us, and don't just start by loving our cultural products and our food, but like see Asian people.
Right.
I think is maybe even like what I want out of this moment more than anything, is like, because my existence and the existence of so many folks that are in positions like me is like, we don't even get the basic humanity to be known by our names a lot of the time,
Yeah.
or to be seen as like outside of stereotypes, or as individuals, or as people who, like, for me, just like on a daily basis, I've had kids come up to me and just say, like, you don't look like you should be teaching the English class. And so to be seen
Mm,
is maybe the first even step to be
okay.
able to deal with racism as a whole, to me. So thanks for having me on tonight. Thanks for listening to me, people in the audience. And we will be back to, I'm sure, before long, talking about something totally less serious than this.
I'm glad we were able to make it serious, though, because again, it helps me with my chops. What do you want to promote? What are you working on? What do you want people to see?
I mean, if you're interested in any of the stuff I talked about tonight, I am this summer. Hopefully, at some point, I'm doing work in this category. I'm writing some stuff. So, patreon.com/, a guy named Nam. It's $1 a month. You might see me rank Girl Scout cookies one week. You might see me write about WandaVision. You might see me do some creative writing that's about this. But I'm starting to take my budding hobby slash, I don't know if you can really call it a career as a writer, whatever that is supposed to entail. That's where you can find me,
Is it
patreon.com.
is it your passion?
In an ideal world, I think I would just be living, which would allow me to write.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's a cop out to your answer or not, but it is something that I love.
Okay. As long as it is something you love. Before you go, I know I asked you the question, but I have
Yes.
another question. I have another one for you that I've been
Oh,
asking a
okay.
lot of my
I love
guests.
these. Yes.
Actually, it's two. It's two. The first one is, please describe your greatest experience in a restaurant.
Okay.
That's the first one. The
Okay.
second one I'll ask after.
Okay. So, um, when you say greatest experience, are you thinking about like what's my best story that happened in a restaurant, or my best time eating, or the best food that I had? That's
Whichever
very
one.
important.
Whichever one, because some people have shared, it was this little mom and pop shop in San Mateo, and it was with his kids, and it was, little out of the way. I shared one where I literally had a meal in Disney World that was the same amount as my mortgage. So it doesn't have to be it's not extravagance. It's just, what's that greatest experience, whether it be a memory, food, whatever.
Honestly, the first thing that came to mind when you said that was like, I don't remember it for the food,
Okay.
but the spontaneity of that day, like
Okay.
Nobu in Malibu,
Mm,
uh, cultural favorite, like place that I went to try to imitate, A-lister lifestyle.
right.
Kanye West sat down at the table behind me.
Okay.
So it's just like, I remember that very well because just it was a very unexpected, spontaneous. It's like a quintessential like LA story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's good. Okay, excellent. So now, beyond family, beyond
Yes.
friends, beyond your car, your home, whatever else. What is your most treasured possession?
I have a memory box.
Okay.
So in a situation where, because I'm always prepared if the fire alarm goes off in my house, I have the
Of
bags
course.
like out because I'm a teacher. Like that's somebody's kid's life on the line. Okay, like you got to take these things seriously.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I am a very intensely sentimental person. So
Okay.
I'm gonna cheat and just say that my memory box is the most valuable thing because it contains everything else.
Excellent. How far back do those memories go? Like when you were little or?
Mostly it's like trinkets, things that I've used to kind of mark my adulthood, like since
Okay.
like late high school now. Yeah,
Right on. Very
yeah,
cool. Well, that's good. So I always and you got my first one about what you wanted to see, so it turned into a
yeah,
whole conversation about aliens. So
yeah,
that was good. But Nam, I appreciate you, man. I thank you for doing this. I know we've had a good back and forth, and I know you're coming up on the time. I didn't mean to take longer than that, but I mean I just wanted to appreciate you and thank you for being on this and everyone else that's been on the show. Definitely, as Paul Hornstein has just said in New York, we have learned to ignore the fire alarm. So exactly. But anyway, stay on the line. So thanks for everyone. And then we'll just go do a quick sign off here and then I'll talk to him. But see you soon, my friend. Everyone else, say peace out to them and then we will talk shortly. Again, thank you everyone for being part of the show. Hopefully you enjoyed yourself. As always, make sure that you are able to share being part of the social club. Hopefully you had a great time. We're going to have another show next week. In a couple weeks, we're going to actually have former ASU quarterback and opera singer Gus Farwell on. We're going to be doing an early 11 a.m., 8 p.m. Spain time. So it's going to be a midday buzz for me. And then on Monday, for Mental Health Monday, Brittany Boyer is going to be on there. She's going to be our guest and she's going to talk about bipolar disorder and her experiences as well. So look for those announcements as well. And hopefully we will see you on there. And as always, I love you. I am grateful for you to being part of this. Make sure you love yourself and especially now, love those around you as well. And as always, make sure you stay safe, keep yourself well, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone, and we will talk soon. Bye.